All right, now we are going to turn our attention to operant conditioning. And we just finished with looking at, sorry about that, looking at classical conditioning. And operant conditioning is much like classical conditioning. It too is associative by nature. It associates a behavior with a reinforcement rather than associating various forms of, rather than associating stimuli together with some response or some outcome. In this case, operant conditioning, it is basically you have a behavior, and with that behavior comes some reinforcement, which then leads to increase or recurrence of behavior, and again another reinforcement. Okay, and so and I'll do RF to stand for reinforcement. So it's a different form of learning, different from classical, because in one case the organism itself is responding, organism is responding, and that's when we're talking about responsive, we're talking about classical, and in this case classical. When we're talking about the organism operating on the world around it, we are referring to then, and I'll just put operating, in other words, it's doing something to its environment. Then in this case, we're talking about operant conditioning. One, the organism responds; the other, the organism operates on the world. So classical conditioning explores the associations between stimuli. Operant conditioning associates actions with certain consequences. So the key person that really kind of started the ball rolling is a guy by the name of Edward Thorndike, and he did something called puzzle boxes with cats. And he noticed the fact that behavior that is rewarded, so rewarded behavior is likely to recur, essentially. And so and that was something that he referred to as the law of effect. And he did multiple studies with cats because they're tend to be so inquisitive in a puzzle box, and they figured out a way to get out of the puzzle box, and they were reinforced with food, and they would decrease their time at solving that particular puzzle box. Well, the next figure that is probably one of the largest figures in psychology is a guy by the name of B.F. Skinner. And Skinner used the concepts from Edward Thorndike to begin to work with his concepts to what he referred to as behavior control. And eventually, this way of looking at things and developing ways of controlling behavior eventually came to be called behaviorism. And essentially, Skinner wasn't really all that interested in what was going on in the brain. He referred to it as the black box. But he was really the first to develop a technology and an experimentation technology to explore this kind of behavior in the various aspects of it. And so what you see here in this diagram up here is something that came to be called the Skinner box. It was an operant chamber, and it actually, when I talk about technology in those days, it really was fairly rudimentary. The entry into the use of the computer age and using computers was relatively new, but he used this to explore different ways of reinforcement and different ways of controlling behavior. And so what you see up here in this diagram are different ways to provide reinforcement. There was the food pellet, there were drops of water, there was the light ended up being a light would come on. If the rat touched the bar, then the food would drop down. Sometimes a sound would occur and it would hit the bar and then the food would drop down. So he used things that we would refer to as primary reinforcers, and these primary reinforcers are things that I innately am reinforced by, which quite naturally food is one of them, and in this case the food was the reinforcer for the rats themselves. And if you were ever to go, and this is probably, if you ever have the opportunity, or maybe you've done it, is to go and watch a dog training, obedience training class. And it uses primarily all of Skinner's discovered behavior control. And that's essentially what it is. The primary reinforcer oftentimes is food again, at least in dog training classes. And the other aspect that is important to understand when we talk about it is something we refer to as shaping. Another word for it was also successive approximations. And if you have ever watched a movie like Stuart Little, if you remember the cats in that movie, essentially what we do is we catch a behavior that's close and we will reinforce that behavior, and then as the behavior gets closer to what I desire, I continue to reinforce it and continue to reinforce it until I'm actually get to the goal behavior itself. And essentially that's exactly what they do with the cats in this case. So it's not necessarily a matter that the cats can't learn. They can, it's just they are slower. They have a lower intelligence rate, if you want to put it that way. Dogs are far easier to train, at least some breeds certainly are. And essentially it all is built off of this same idea of operant conditioning. The behavior is seen, and that's primarily what you're going to see, is the behavior is looked for or is emitted by the organism, and then it is reinforced accordingly. And those are the key points when we talk about operant conditioning. So in one case it is responding, and in the other case it's operating. One case is associating stimuli, the other is having a behavior, and then it is reinforced.